Hello, everyone. This is Benjamin Yoder. Thank you again for subscribing to the One Control Port Patreon. We'll be doing another article reading this week. If you don't know, we basically pull a random article from my backlog, and then I go ahead and read it. Last time we did Xenosaga Episode 3. Weirdly enough, we ended up with Xenoblade Chronicles X this time around. Wasn't really planned, but with Xenoblade Chronicles 3 being announced, this is somewhat relevant to some degree, so was not planned, but happy coincidence twice in a row, actually, because I mentioned Xenosaga Episode 3 last week, around the time I was talking about it on Twitter, and then it came up as my random article, so weird coincidences back to back. So if you don't know, this is basically where I just go through and read an old article I have. Typically I do an audio-only version of this. I'm going to try doing this as video as well. I could see if exporting it as audio-only is an option too, but I don't really know how that's going to upload to Patreon at this point. So for now, we're just going to focus on the video version, and if I can get the audio version up, I will go ahead and do that as well. So the reason I want to do video is because it might be easier to kind of see what is actually in the text in the video version, because I'll be able to show you on screen, as you can see here. One thing though is that the actual title of the article doesn't really fit my window here, but the title of this article is basically called "Taking 70 Hours to Find Xenoblade Chronicles X," or to find the fun in Xenoblade Chronicles X. So this was written in June 24th, 2016. So this is pretty shortly after release, I think. I believe maybe this was like a late 2015 release. I actually got the game slightly early because I went to a Toys R Us and the game was on the shelf, I think like a week ahead of time. And I think normally they would not have sold it to me. But in this case they did, and the reason why is because there was a guy up there by himself, and there's another group of people basically doing a bunch of really weird stuff with layaways and having to return stuff. And so I stood in line for probably about an hour and a half trying to buy Xenoblade Chronicles X, just waiting for this guy to figure out what's going on with what's going on up front. I'm very aware that they will not try to sell this video game to me, so I'm kind of, hedging my bets here. And when he rang it up, it was just like, oh, you can't buy this yet. And I think just because he knew I was waiting so long, he was just like, okay, I'm going to ring this up as like a generic $60 charge and you can get out of here. I wasn't rude about it or anything. I think a lot of people in that situation would, apply pressure to try to get them to sell it. But honestly, I don't think I'm just not really that kind of person. I don't really like pushing people's buttons to try to get something. I don't know. I don't like that. I know it works. I've worked in industries before where you do have to accommodate customers, and the more pressure they put on you, the more likely you are to do something. I don't like that is the case, but it kind of makes sense why that happens. So anyways, this article was right after I lost a 100-hour save file in Xenoblade Chronicles X. So I was at the time more or less given up on beating the game, and I finally beat the game last year in 2021. I did a casual review, so if you want to see kind of my final thoughts on Xenoblade Chronicles X, you can see what that is. I haven't read this article in a very long time. I don't remember if this is more or less a review where I basically just say, I don't know, I just haven't finished the game, so I don't feel comfortable calling this review, or if this has more to do with the fact that, I had a very rough, time adjusting to what Xenoblade Chronicles X was. So we'll go ahead and get started here, and then I'll, per usual, add some commentary here. With the text on screen, you can now see where I mess up reading, because I'm pretty terrible at reading stuff out loud unless I've recently wrote it. So anyways, here we go. I've had a rough experience with Xenoblade Chronicles X. After clocking in 100 hours, my time with it ended prematurely. I overwrote my save file with a new file. Whoops. Even before my stupidity ruined my playthrough, I had a lot of trouble coming to terms with my feelings about the game. It wasn't until the last 30 hours that I really started to enjoy what the title had to offer. Monolith Soft is traditionally a Japanese RPG developer, and technically, Xenoblade Chronicles is just that. It is indeed an RPG developed by a Japanese team. Nonetheless, the game's design is significantly different from typical linear funnel from the typical linear funnel of Monolith Soft's previous releases, as well as JRPGs in general. In the case of X, it's more of a playground of content versus a single path. Because of the open design, there's little determining where you go and for what. For all intents and purposes, the entire landscape is available to you from the get-go. There's a general order to the continent you visit, but there's no concrete structure for when or what reason you'll be visiting a new one. It's largely up to the player and what quests they accept. This fundamental design behind X is where ultimately I had trouble. It feels closer to what a Western RPG would be, or at least what I'd imagine it'd be. I focused on the Wii during the last generation, so I completely missed WRPG's breakthrough into the mainstream. I had the intention to check them out, yet here I am today with the oldies like The Elder Scrolls Oblivion and Fallout 3 still untouched. This is still true today, and I don't know if I've played a true open world Western RPG still. I can't think of any. I think Xenoblade Chronicles X is still my only real brush with this kind of thing, so... Speaking of the word brush, I just say it right here. Aside from a brush with Grand Theft Auto, large-scale design is something I've only been familiar with through massively multiplayer online RPGs. The original Xenoblade has large and open environments, though the focus is on pockets of stuff to do linked together through a linear tale. There's an option to return to most of the previous areas, but the core design has you going from one environment to the next. In the case of X, traversing to a new continent simply adds to the list of places you can do stuff. Even after spending 20 hours in the first area, you'll continue to do major tasks there throughout the game. Essentially, the content was made to fill the environments versus the environments being made to drive the content. I get what I'm trying to say there, but I feel like that sentence doesn't really work in the way I'm thinking it might work. The lack of change in scenery set in a feeling of stagnation. By the time I hit around 35 hours, there was a moment where I questioned what I had really accomplished. Clearly, I was doing something, however, I had a hard time putting my finger on exactly what. I also had this constant stress of feeling overwhelmed. X isn't ashamed to show you how much there is to do. The map divided into hexagons present the next major objective for each section of the environment. Instead of filtering based on what you can access, it shows you everything at once. Over the years, I have heard stories of players' experiences with the Elder Scrolls Skyrim where they almost all completely ignored the main arc and spent hours upon hours getting lost in the world. For me, the constant pull in the different directions was information overload. I actually really like this part of Xenoblade Chronicles X where they just break out everything into hexagons and assign important events or objectives to each hexagon, because it really kind of focuses you on finding that one thing and knowing what you can ignore in the meantime. It is a lot of content still. I'm still on board with that, but the map design of this game I think was really smart overall. And the fact it was on the gamepad, I think, was really convenient as well. Especially, during load screens. If you didn't know, in Xenoblade Chronicles X, this is a Wii U game, so you're using the gamepad. This is all me talking right now, not the article. You can select, or you can use the gamepad to, go through menus during load screens. And this is a game that had a lot of load screens. And maybe I'll say this, down the line. But, I think that's really cool that you can sit there and just kind of, manage different things in the menu while you're waiting for the game to load. Obviously, that's going to be less of a thing going forward with solid state drives and things like that on most consoles now. But, I always thought this was really cool. And, I'll be sad that will be missing probably if they ever re-release this game on the Switch or something like that. So, still no Xenoblade Chronicles X for the Switch, actually. There's this sense I feel like nobody's asked for Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Switch in recent years either. It's kind of interesting. There's this sense of urgency and necessity to everything. Collect this item, complete that task, talk to this person, or whatever else. At the end of the day, I never felt like I was getting anywhere. Sure, the core story was slowly unraveling, but X's central plot is hardly the main draw of the experience. You can plow through it, though doing so ultimately feels like pushing against the design of the game. These missions have large difficulty gaps between them. Dying enough will ease up the difficulty, nevertheless, it is clear the player is intended to be doing something else during interludes. I used the word like nevertheless a ton back then, and I don't know why. In general, side quests are rarely a priority for me. If I complete one, cool. Still, I'm not going to go out of my way to finish it if it keeps me from reaching the end. Wait, in general, side quests are rarely a priority for me. If I complete one, cool. Still, I'm not going to go out of my way to finish it if it keeps me from reaching the end. I feel like it's worded weird, but maybe I'm just having a weird brain fart. However, X essentially forces the player to interact with all levels of its content. In addition to the main path, there are character-specific side stories that feel essential to the experience. A large portion of the party members' character development comes from these. Then there's more city-related side missions that often contain small story arcs to teach the player more about the planet, life in the main city, alien races, and other small bits of world building. At an even lower tier are the job board assignments, which are completed purely for the rewards. At the bottom of the chain, there are dialogue trees you can have with certain NPCs and a group of members around the city. At the bottom of the chain, so I'm saying this is below even the low tier job board stuff. I'm not sure what I'm trying to say here. Let me just start over with that. At an even lower tier are job board assignments, which are completed purely for the rewards. At the bottom of the chain, there are dialogue trees you can have with certain NPCs and group members around the city. Even outside of these, there's excavating key points on the map, laying probes to analyze the region, discovering scenic points, managing the probe network to increase income, a collectopedia to fill out an item list, gear augmented to craft. I'm probably missing a handful of other random things to also interact with. Like, when I was reading through this, I was thinking, like, this is a lot of information that isn't really explained, but at the same time, I think that might be the point I was trying to make, of just, like, there's way too much stuff to do in this game, and a lot of it is kind of somewhat meaningless. Trying to understand exactly how these tasks fit between the main missions was tough. I was at a loss for what to focus on and couldn't find a good way to juggle content. This isn't necessarily just me trying to understand how to have fun with the game either. X gives you a lot of pushback that keeps the player from doing the things they want. There are a lot of situations where it presents objectives that may not necessarily be doable at this point in time. The main secondary missions have level, relationship, and quest completion requirements. The troublesome ones are the relationship, which require the player to spend hours building a character affinity so you can do one storyline. It's made even worse by making the players actively level each character, so over half the time, the party was a burden because they sat anywhere between 10 to 30 levels lower than my character. It reduces the focus on building a team based on classes, as it requires the player to drag around members who simply need some buddy love. There are some barriers that aren't necessarily... I just want to comment on that real quick. I don't know if I had this problem in the second playthrough. I think in my second playthrough, I consistently mixed members in and out of my party throughout the entire game, and I think that helped keep their levels kind of consistent. They would fall behind, don't get me wrong, but I don't think I had it as bad as like 30 levels behind. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'd have to go back and listen to my review probably. There are some barriers that aren't necessarily official restrictions. It's not uncommon mid-objective to find an enemy placement keeps the player from completing an assignment. High-level foes are haphazardly placed throughout the environment. Level 20 quest-specific enemies might be sitting snug with their random level 50 monster. Even if they're not aggressive, many combat skills have area of effects, and AI party members won't be shy about shooting in the direction of the beast. Changing the time of day in-game can help, yet also introduces new foes that can cause other headaches. In the end, I ended up with a lot of mid-progress missions that I simply had to leave behind for one reason or another. This is a problem all Xenoblade games have, and I get why people view it as a positive. To me, at least specifically for this specific game that was so focused on side quests and stuff, it drove me crazy in this game. The loose ends start to build up, and X doesn't handle bulk information well. The player can track one quest at a time. Others that are accepted will appear on the minimap, though the size of the world is so massive that it's rare to cross paths with one not being tracked. Although there's already a huge number of menus and an excessively cluttered user interface, often it can be unclear where to find things. Certain tasks will have markers, where others will have none at all. There's something to be said about not painting an arrow to every point of interest. However, listing this monster appears on this continent with no additional indication does nobody any good. Since there are 5 continents, they're essentially asking the player to search a fifth of the entire landmass available. Attempting to comb through an entire continent for one thing takes a lot of time, especially when limited to traveling on foot. Unlocking the ability to pilot a mech, called a skell, helps tremendously, but hardly solves the problem. Exactly when you get your mech depends on your pacing. For me, it was 40 hours. Exploring on foot does communicate just how large the landscape is, and there's value to having the player get a sense of its full scale. That being said, I wouldn't exactly call it a fun way to travel, especially with all the zigzagging needed to be done to collect items scattered in the environment. There's like these, I didn't explain this in there for some reason, but like these little crystals that you can pick up like all over the map, and like it's really kind of nice because for materials and stuff, all you have to do is like walk near it basically. But at the same time, because it's so easy to pick up and because they're spread out all in front of you, you kind of like have to navigate left and right to pick them up. So when you're in the mech, it's not a big deal because you move fast enough, but on foot, it's really kind of slows your momentum even further because you're like wiggling back and forth as you try to run somewhere. You don't have to do that, obviously, although you'll be bypassing a lot of items. That being said, okay, I already read that. Despite all these problems, I kept coming back to Xenoblade Chronicles X. Because I'm a Monolith Soft fanboy? Maybe. The combat largely pulled from the original is still quite fun, and the addition of chaining skills via battle dialogue is a nice twist on the formula. Overdrive system also very cool in this game, although it is incredibly complex, and I had no idea how it worked this first time I played through it, despite getting 100 hours in. The world itself gets built out extensively with a lot of small quests showing the relationships between minor characters. I love that kind of stuff, I will say. Each race has their own culture you learn about through these storylines. While minor stories on their own, as a whole, they flesh out X more than the main plot line. Like other titles focused around a central town, there's also a nice homey feels at times. Characters get a chance to kick back and relax, even if just for a little bit. Before I move on from this, I do want to say that is something I do really appreciate a game like Xenoblade Chronicles X, which is very focused on one town and maintaining a single town. It does give you a feeling of like I have a home base to return to and like a place that I'm a part of, versus like a game where you're just constantly moving from town to town to town, right? So that's one thing I do like about Xenoblade Chronicles X. I appreciated X for being its own game versus a straight-up sequel to the original, yet I don't think I could say I had fun for most of my experience. Ultimately, the sheer amount of content and the number of barriers was a source of frustration, and the lack of direction and environmental diversity made it feel like I hadn't gotten anywhere, despite dumping almost 2 RPGs worth of time into it. Eventually, I fell into a flow. I would spend 10 hours doing a variety of side objectives while spacing out more in-depth character-specific missions between all the other little bits and pieces that came in between. I also almost exclusively kept new members in my party to grind relationships, which created some unnecessarily challenging moments. In exchange, I was getting a steady stream of story-heavy character quests. Because of that flow, the last 30 hours clicked with me. I was having a great time jumping between all of these different levels of content, which kept the grind fresh. Now, not that me finding ways to enjoy Xenoblade Chronicles X to its fullest excuses the game's issues. Familiar with WRPGs or not, there are some headache-inducing design decisions even I can see. Understanding how I personally wanted to take on X was key in finding the fun in it. I can't say non-linear open worlds are my favorite game structure, but at the very least, I feel like I'm in a position where I can fully enjoy myself the next time I approach one. And when I did go back and finally play through Xenoblade Chronicles X, I really do feel like my experience playing it the first time helped me enjoy it the second time around. Playing through that game twice, I think really did in the end make my experience better. So maybe as somebody who maybe had more experience with Western RPGs and the content flow of that and how to manage that, maybe Xenoblade Chronicles X would have been a better experience the first time around. But for me, that was like a very new thing for me, and I had a very hard time adjusting from like a typical JRPG to Xenoblade Chronicles X. So yeah, I mean, I really like Xenoblade Chronicles X overall, but I still just kind of like I kind of hope Monolith Soft never does anything quite like it again. Although even though the game feels like it is lacking in a lot of ways, because it was their like first foray in this kind of thing, I just don't really feel a lot of need for them to go back to that style. But I appreciate it at the very least. If you know me, I'm always gonna say I want Xeno to not be a franchise really anymore. I want them to move on to something else. And if they do keep making Xeno games, I want them to all be very different. And Xenoblade Chronicles X, even though the combat looks a lot like Xenoblade Chronicles, very much fits that meld of being very different from Xenoblade Chronicles 1, and also what came after it. Xenoblade Chronicles X is definitely the most unique in the series when it comes to Xenoblade games for that. So anyways, that's it for that. Thanks for coming. Thank you again for donating to the One Control Port Patreon. I appreciate it. Hopefully I'll get some more diverse content coming up in the next couple months here, but this February is going to be a little busy, so we're going to be sticking somewhat to the norm. At the very least, I could bring this up on the screen here so we could read along with me if you want to. If you're like, I prefer this in an audio format, let me know. That'd be helpful for me to know. I'm pretty much operating blind on the Patreon, so the more you can give me information about what you want with the Patreon, the better it's going to be for me, and the more I'm going to be able to better serve you. Right now, I'm just kind of guessing at what to put out. So, but obviously, there's only so much I can do. Like, I don't want to lock certain types of content behind Patreon, like more normal content. I would prefer to keep that stuff public in different ways. But again, just let me know what you want. Worst case scenario, I just say no, right? So I'm always happy to hear what you want to say. But anyways, thank you so much. Bye.